Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I'm Jim Henry and here with my good friend and co-host Sal Lafreri. Today's topic is the evolution of connected devices from the old days of hardwired dedicated communications on into the Internet of Things and how the vulnerability of that Internet is now driving us to new standards. Today's guest joining us via Skype is Pierre Bourgex, who has spent 30 years as a global security consultant and innovator through his experience with the RAND Corporation, the U.S. State Department, ADT Tyco Security, High Security, Wallace International, Secure State, and Boo Needham. Currently, Pierre is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of ESI Convergent LLC. Welcome, Pierre.
Hey, how are you?
So, Sal, tee this up for Pierre. This is an interesting and very dynamic topic. What are your thoughts? We are yet going to a new evolution of platforms. Everybody thought a few years ago that the internet was going to be the one size fits all solution, making everything simple. Just get rid of all these dedicated coaxial lines and hard copper communications, whether it's 422, 232, all the different types of hardwire communications that we had. We're going to get rid of all of this cost of electricians running all these dedicated wires, and all we got to do is drop all our devices on the internet. And now we hear, well, not so fast, Bubba Boy. We got some problems here. So what's your thoughts?
It's just in a lot of ways, it's sort of overwhelming, right? There's so much stuff that, you can actually poke some fun at when you think about all of the technology and, the old, what does it take? 120, 220? Yeah, 220, 120, whatever it takes, just pump it up. The vulnerabilities, to see where we're going with the Internet of Things, to understand how things are becoming hackable, how things are becoming way more problematic, way more intrusive in our life. And then you look at the other stuff that sort of hits the mind is that all of the problems that we're going to wind up having today, none of the laws are catching up to the technology, right? The law is always behind technology. And you start wondering how all of this can be used, in an adverse situation. And you put all of that together and you think about it as a CEO of a corporation, you're looking at it and you're going, okay, what are really my risks and vulnerabilities? And I think when it comes down to this, there are so many sayings, right? That sometimes, you forget about the answers, you don't even know the questions. And I think that really lies into this. And I think what we want to do with today's show is basically to kind of start with the history of the stuff and kind of walk somebody through, because I really think the leadership today in corporations and security directors and CISOs are dealing with the problems that are addressing them every day that they're getting hit with. And I think what we really need to do is start with a good old basic of where did we really start and how did we get to where we are today? So I think that hopefully that sort of lines it up and tees it up for you, PM. But
Pierre brings a very good and deep perspective from the IT side of the world, but has certainly lived through and worked with and understands the platforms that I mentioned earlier that preceded the internet, and can certainly see all of the benefits of the economic benefits and the ease of use, that drove it, but is very positioned to be able to articulate where the vulnerabilities and where the problems are, and where we might go from here. So, Pierre, with that.
So instead of just giving it this T-ball, let's just because I'm petrified a little bit. It's we've given you way too much to think about. Let's go back. Let's kick it back for a sec. Let's talk about the old days, right? I mean, all of us, not calling you old, but all of us have been around the business long enough. Let's talk about the old days, about the big command centers. When people walked in, they wanted to feel secure, that whole evolution, right? You got the big command centers, people felt secure. Then we wind up with the internet coming in and things start shrinking and getting smaller. And then they wind up, we have 9/11, then people want to see the command centers again. So let's go back to the days with the big command centers and that technology back then. What about all of that? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good starting point. The world that we once lived in, you look it back in the security environment, we had large security operational centers. We had feeds coming in from a variety of cameras and access control points. And even access control was fundamental at that point, right? And it was really easy because it was a segmented environment. It was separated from the whatever infrastructure was already being established. But really in the 80s, really, I mean, if you look back, let's just say 70s, late 70s, early 80s, really it was a guy, a group of guards who were sitting in front of large monitors. You had, usually forensic data because you were using versus trying to, get the camera and find the incident and deal with the incident. So there was really a lot of detection and a lot of, reaction, right? Prevention was, basically let's put some guards in the right places. Let's do all this stuff manually and make sure that we've got guys that can prevent somebody from entering a building and really was fundamentally what we all grew up in, from the days of really guards and guns, right? This is what we understood. So technology was just really an attribute to that. It was never intended to go beyond that until really we start seeing the development now of how easily it was able to connect other devices. Now, the operational environment where the networks were, that really didn't start until pretty much the mid 80s, right? And when you start seeing some of the technology in terms of communication systems and data, storage, and people starting to realize, we have to communicate by the internet. I mean, we have to start communicating in regards to emails. And really this starts in the 90s, right? I mean, we start realizing that we went from, storing data from an major IBM server to now, we start communicating. We have the birth of, Microsoft, the birth of Apple. So, this was all to help really streamline communications, right? Streamline the ability to get things done. Well, the reality is that physical security is going, well, you know what? We've got our stuff, right? We all are connected devices with coax, RJ59. We've got 232 connections, just basic serial port connections. And so we weren't really paying attention to what was going on that internet side because, frankly, that was for data, that was for communications and emails. Nobody was thinking that this would never come, the physical security way, right? And so, unfortunately, that's what kind of led a lot of the physical security professionals, from ASIS and others, just saying, this is never going to be, this is never really going to happen. So all of a sudden we get into the late 90s and, suddenly there's, the beginning of an IP camera, there's the establishment of an IP camera. And people are going, why do we need an IP camera? Well, because frankly, we've got an infrastructure already for our network. And if we just basically put that camera on the network, we'll be able to actually connect directly to a laptop, right? Which says what? Or even a CPU, we'll just say, because laptops weren't even around really at that point. And so we start saying, wait a minute, you're going to connect that to, because here's the thing, right? So we get the beginning of companies like Brevo, and all of a sudden we start seeing, companies starting to create technology that allows maybe a HR director to connect with access control, right? And so all of a sudden, things are beginning to change by
the pushback,
really let's say late 90s. We all know what ends up happening, right? So all of a sudden now, the internet starts becoming larger, right? And networks and companies are starting to rely on it operationally. They're starting to use the internet to communicate and also connect devices, and really devices really from floor systems, like say, we'll just say, from the motor industry, all, to the energy industry, we start seeing things beginning to start connecting. Well, all of a sudden 9/11 happened. Boom, world changes overnight, right? Because by the 90s, you realize one thing, even though we're connected, right, we're not secure. And what ends up happening, really, you can say 95 to 2001, those systems are starting to connect. We're starting to put Ethernet lines out into, to touch devices in field. And we're starting to get connectivity, and we're starting to relay data via internet or via our network. So internal and external. This was a big change. And reality is that this affected from we're talking the military defense complex all the way down to really the small business level. Because why did network become more important? Because now you could affordably install a system using your network infrastructure rather than having to run cables and do all this. You could actually connect. And the reality is that what people were looking for is convenience. And you add convenience to security, all of a sudden, the security side gets to the point where we go, wait a minute, I don't need all these people to start doing this remotely. I want to do this and have control of it on premise. So that's when, I'll just say by 2001, when 9/11 took place, on-premise versus off-premise began in earnest. And that's where, the rubber meets the road. A lot of things began to change. And I can tell you right now that that's, the age of the internet or the age of connected systems began.
Well, it was definitely 9/11 that spiked the requirement for a lot more devices. And I think the hesitancy to jump on, to utilize the internet, was forced away because there was just we would bury ourselves in dedicated cable. And the cost of continuing down that path and not using the efficiencies of the internet were just economically prohibitive. So that really did trigger it, the adaptation.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think what you end up having is inevitably people start realizing, well, can we dedicate an infrastructure for these amount of cameras, this access control, these sensors, and can we inevitably, and this is when the first conversations between IT and physical security started taking place, where they said, well, wait a minute, you can't put that bandwidth on our infrastructure because we can't support that. And that's when the first conversations of convergence, people thought convergence was IT and physical security in conflict, right? And so if they're coming together, they're converging like two hammers, two fists hitting each other. And I think at the end of the day, that was when the big conversation began, right? And now we start seeing the starting of the spark of dark fiber, the whole concept of can we separate this with fiber and just, but then the cost, right? Then there was the big cost factor. So it was all about connecting now devices and doing it in a way where we could actually control those devices. And again, the domain between, and domain, what I mean, the structure between IT and physical security had this monumental wall between it. And I think that's really was the hard part in the initial years of really connected devices.
Well, that'll tee us up for the second segment, which will focus, more deeply on the IoT or the internet. But we'll take a break here and just remind everyone that you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by Jim Henry, myself, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our web page at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So, IoT, then comes the internet. And everything looked really rosy right after 9/11. We were going to solve this problem of reducing all the economic costs of hardwire, but it didn't take long for us to start seeing issues. First, I guess, really just the bandwidth of everything that people were trying to throw on there. I've used the term, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something many times in my life. And we found that, by dumping, companies dumping and integrators as well, dumping all sorts of video, onto the infrastructure, and it just couldn't handle it. So that was really the first oops that we encountered, right?
I agree. I think what it boils down to is that at that moment in time, a lot of companies, large enterprises, had put a lot of money in their infrastructure. They had spent years and years building their fortress, right? And all of a sudden now we have this network expansion, this IT expansion. And it wasn't just an expansion, it was an explosion. And frankly, I always say the reason why a lot of things happen is when the public feels comfortable with the internet or with something. And as the public got more comfortable, right, we started seeing the use of Yahoo, the accounts, and the use of, if you look at all the different, the new accounts that were created to, Facebook was about to explode onto the scene. All these things were really ways for people to communicate. And with that in mind, right, leadership at organizations were starting to see the pressure of boards starting to say, well, why can't we leverage this to do things? And so, and I think that boils down to it is that the large corporations also heard this, the Honeywells, the Rockwells, the Lockheed Martins, the Ingersoll Rands, all these companies began to listen to this and say, you know what, we need to get onto this. And all of a sudden, with companies that were always stuck to serial ports are now realizing we need to now put Ethernet ports and on those devices. So all of a sudden now we had internet-ready devices being built. And that just changed the real, pendulum, started moving from left to right. And, I always believe that it's always hard to get a pendulum to really sway perfectly in the middle. So it's always this banging effect. It goes back and forth. And so all of a sudden now, boards are putting pressure on security directors. Security directors are putting pressure on their security infrastructure, and CIOs are now becoming a real story. We never had a CIO. We had an IT guy, and the IT guy started getting structured. And so the convergence of telephony, right, or the telephone, and it becomes important as well because communication becomes important, right? So how do we see the birth of Cisco Communications, the birth of all these communication companies realizing that, hey, we not only have to control the internet, we also have to control, telephony and telephony. Always hard to say, but in terms of the actual ability to communicate. So that really leads to the birth of a completely new industry. We see now, IP connected technology that's used for voice, all right, for speaking across the network. And that just basically blew the doors wide open, right, at that point. And this also leads, if you remember clearly, in the old days, right, this leads finally to cellular communication, right? And that the initial birth of cellular communication. And so if you think about communication as a whole, we start seeing in the 90s and in the early 2000s that the proliferation of communication devices, be it sensors, be it cameras, be it we'll just say SCADA control systems. All of a sudden, we see all these things take place. And that's when really I think that if you see 2001, 2002, when communication was critical, right? The report on the 9/11 report clearly stated that the agencies were not communicating. And we're not just talking about guys picking up a phone. The systems couldn't communicate. And so billions, trillions of dollars was pumped into the industries to start communicating. And that led to, if you look at from 2005 and today, the exponential increase of devices and proliferation of devices. And that's not even talking about the threats. And that's what we're going to get into next is the threats.
Yeah. Well, the technology did catch up and deal with the capacity issue, but it didn't take long. Like I say, around 2008, 2009, to start seeing, the next level of the next challenge, to this platform, which was security, and that'll be our segment 3. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by Jim Henry and Sal Frary. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Let's now get deep into what has been in the newspapers and in the media now for, I guess, 7 years, is threats and hacking and what have you. And Pierre, it doesn't surprise you because, as you have said on multiple occasions, the internet was never built with security in mind, and it was now exposing itself to that.
Yeah, and I think this is really, the culmination of the past into now, the discussion of how is the internet going to not only help us, but not become our worst enemies. And I think that in effect is a natural progression to a certain degree, because guess what? Why do we have security anyway, right? Security is to prevent people from doing bad things. Well, unfortunately, the internet was never created in its birth to really be secure. It was really just created as a communication tool. And that communication tool was basically foundationally what was being used to support everything that was being created to be connected. So connected means now that if I have Ethernet, if I have an IP address, if I have something tied to PKI or public key, I can now connect, right? I have something that allows me to communicate with a trusted in a trusted way. All right. Well, that was great. So PKI was created by the government in effect to help establish a communication path, right? That was at least we knew who it was. We didn't know if it was secure, but we knew who it was, sort of. So the point I'm making is this. Security from the standpoint of communication was never fixed. It was band-aided. It was band-aided by virtually every technology that started hitting the market because people, frankly, wanted to make money. They wanted to use this new resource to start adding devices and adding structure and adding opportunity. And then when applications began, because we now had technology like a laptop, or we had an app that we now could use, all of a sudden we had the birth of virtualized networks, right? That could support all of this data and this infrastructure behind the apron, which we then called the cloud later on in the real near future, which was basically the late 2000s. So at the end of the day, the problem is as you connected these devices, the first problem was bandwidth, right? And we started toggling, we started creating, Cisco created something called a firewall. A firewall would be the first step in trying to stop bad stuff from happening at a connected device. And then as you had more connected devices, we created more firewalls. These firewalls were little devices that had the ability to determine what was bad, what was good, could you do that, and could you not do that? And would start regulating, of course, the connection. Wow, we're just going, all right, well, this is cool. We can kind of secure it. Well, unfortunately, as we all know, the bad actors, we're all sitting there waiting. And at the end of the day, this leads to the birth of the perimeter. We created now the establishment of a perimeter. And the perimeter meant we had to prevent people from getting in from an internet-based environment, external threat. Now, that, if you really think about it, okay, that's probably as close as you want to get to a physical security. Well, yeah, we're trying to prevent people from getting in too. And so, so that started the whole path of creating process, right, for the internet. We started realizing we needed policy and procedures, right? We had to create structure quickly. Well, while the physical security world, we really didn't have structure. We just had, monitor, react, deter, detect, all that kind of wonderful stuff. ASIS would just, had their processes. You had your teaching of how to become a good guard, how to do good things. And frankly, that had nothing to do with the internet. But the internet, realizing that, this was the wild, wild west, and a lot of money was being poured into it, people were realizing, like Oracle, hey, we got to create processes. We got to develop structure. So all of a sudden, the big four, Price Waterhouse Cooper, Deloitte started getting in the game and realizing we got to help make these happen for our clients, because we can't just have accounting. Can't worry about business, profit and loss. We got to worry about how do they use the internet, and because that's a big problem if we don't do it right. So that's when a security director was created. And really, at the end of the day, we're talking about an IT director, internet technology director, was involved in defining kind of what that looked like. What was the architecture now? How do we structure this so that we can secure it?
So
because
that basically,
now we got all these devices and we don't know what to do.
So that basically brings back in all of the costs that we thought we were saving by the simplicity of the internet, eliminating all of the hardwired, dedicated cabling. Now we've got another, monster that we've created with all of the management and overhead and administrative responsibilities of policing a platform that was never built to be secure. That really then forces us to think, well, is there another way that we can retain these efficiencies that the internet has brought us, but deal with the security problems without creating another enormous infrastructure, like the whole IT admin group, dwarfing really the manpower that was part of the security department to begin with.
I totally agree. And I think what you end up having, of course, is now you have IT in effect becoming larger, right? Physical security, which already had its own domain, it hadn't disappeared. It was still there, but they were protecting the walls, right? Now we have devices, because IP connected devices are now being created exponentially. The rise of the IP camera, the rise of IP enabled access control. All of a sudden now, they're going, wait a minute here. IT is beginning to decide, well, why do I need this on my network? I don't want this on my network. I don't need this on my network. And this all started, frankly, right, if you think about it, from operational systems like air control systems, like all these controls, these elevator control systems. All of this now starting to use that infrastructure because people want to remotely access. So this is starting to happen really at the mid 2000s. Well, what happens? All of a sudden, we'll just talk from the standpoint of the we'll call it 0 day. And 0 day is a way we explain a zero day vulnerability that has been detected. Well, I called 0 day Target, right? Target was the big hit to the industry that nobody saw coming. What happened was it was the first time that an air control system, which was IP connected, which had its own software, right, was now connected. It had a maintenance program that was now connected. They were connecting it onto the internet so that they could actually get connectivity to the rest of the building. But lo and behold, that building, that internet was we call it a flat network. It was connected, but all was connected directly to their operational system. Well, what people did not realize that there was a vulnerability on that target system, on that air control system, which inevitably got into the target database. And in that one moment, it changed the history of where communications and how communications would be used. And this is what started when in 2001, after 9/11, NIST was created, which was basically the organization for the government to support technology or specifically IT, right? Building frameworks to make sure everybody's doing the right thing. Guess what? At that moment, the world just realized that, wait a minute, this data breach just took thousands of credit card information from the target storage of data, and now was basically on the market, meaning it was on, we call it the dark web, where anybody could buy it. And they were selling, we call it credentials for $1.50 in those days, $1.50 a credential. Now it's a lot less, but in those days it was expensive. So there were people making billions of dollars on that. And that was the beginning. That really, I could say, was the beginning of where we are today in terms of, oh my God, we've got to separate infrastructure. We've got to create more secure communication. And now you have the organizations starting to realize across the board that, wait a minute, we're vulnerable. And this just exploded because now you have nation states. At that moment, we had hackers were just one guy, two guys, friends, and they were doing malicious activity. It was the beginning that people realized they could get paid for data.
I think we're going to leave it right there and sort of wrap this up. We want to thank Pierre for joining us via Skype today. For those of you listening, we will have a second show with Pierre on talking about convergence issues and sort of picking up where we left off. So with that, we want to remind everyone that you've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by Jim Henry and myself, Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe to the show, like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you're interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or you'd like us to consult with us, please go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com and you can set that up there. Also, if you happen to know someone that would make a great guest or you think that there's a topic you would like us to cover, please, again, go to the webpage, contact us, theriskadvisor.com, make the suggestion. We would love to hear from you, as well as if you have any questions for us or our guest. And remember that you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in next week.